Have you ever wondered what happens when an object from the past carries the weight of countless souls lost to madness? Sebastian Thorne was about to find out in the most terrifying way. Once a rising star in the world of classical music, his life had taken a tragic turn after a personal loss that shattered not only his career, but his mind. In a desperate attempt to revive his fading reputation, he stumbled upon an old, dusty violin in an antique shop. The shopkeeper, with a peculiar grin, warned him that the instrument had a history, one steeped in mystery, death, and madness. But Sebastian, blinded by the promise of the violin's unique tone, dismissed the warning. Little did he know, the violin's haunting melodies were not meant for the living. From the moment he laid his hands on the instrument, something shifted. The air around him grew heavier, like a storm brewing in the distance, waiting to engulf him in its chaos. The violin's wood was smooth but cold to the touch, and the moment he drew the bow across the strings, a low, eerie note echoed through the room. It felt as if the violin was breathing, waiting, watching. The sound lingered longer than it should have, fading into a chilling silence that filled the air with an oppressive weight. Sebastian shrugged off the feeling, blaming his imagination. But that night, as he lay in bed, he couldn't shake the sense that something was off. The walls of his room seemed closer, shadows longer, and in the distance he thought he could hear faint music. His music playing from somewhere deep within the house. Before we unravel this dark and twisted tale of obsession and madness, make sure to subscribe and hit the like button. If you're ready to journey into the unknown, you won't want to miss what happens next. Because in this story, the music never truly stops. The dreams began subtly, almost innocuously at first. Sebastian would fall into a deep sleep, only to find himself in a strange, dimly lit room. It wasn't his bedroom, but it felt familiar, like a distant memory pulling at the edges of his mind. The air was thick, humid, and carried the faint metallic scent of decay. In the corner of the room stood a single chair, and on it rested the cursed violin. Every night he would approach it, compelled by an unseen force, and his fingers would wrap around the bow with a mind of their own. As the bow touched the strings, the familiar haunting melody would fill the room, but it was distorted, warped, as though the music itself was crying out in agony. The room around him seemed to pulse with each note, the walls expanding and contracting as if they were alive, breathing in rhythm with the cursed violin. A cold breeze brushed against his skin, though there were no windows, no doors, no way out. The music grew louder, more frantic, each stroke of the bow dragging Sebastian deeper into the darkness. His heart pounded in his chest as the room grew colder, the air thickening with a strange, musty odor, like the smell of old books forgotten in a damp basement. As he played, his vision blurred and the shadows around him seemed to shift, taking on grotesque forms. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw a movement, something crawling, something inhuman. He tried to stop playing, but his hands wouldn't obey. They moved on their own, as if possessed by the violin itself. His breathing quickened, the air heavy with the smell of rot, and the sound of distant whispers began to fill the room. "You cannot leave," they hissed, barely audible over the screeching notes of the violin. His hands trembled, his mind screaming to wake up, but the dream held him captive, the music tightening its grip on his soul. The melody shifted, becoming violent, dissonant, as if the violin was trying to tear through reality itself. The room began to warp, the walls bending inward, closing in on him. Sebastian felt the weight of an unseen presence pressing down on him, suffocating, crushing. The shadows writhed and twisted, becoming more defined, more human, yet horribly disfigured, faces contorted in pain, eyes wide with terror, mouths gaping open in silent screams. They surrounded him, closing in, their cold, decayed fingers reaching out to touch him, to pull him into their eternal nightmare. Just as the darkness threatened to swallow him whole, Sebastian woke with a gasp, drenched in sweat, the echo of the violin's mournful tune still ringing in his ears. His heart raced, the lingering scent of rot still in his nose. The room around him was still, but something felt wrong. The violin was there, propped against the wall, untouched. but he swore he could still hear the faintest whisper of the melody, beckoning him to play again. The line between dream and reality had begun to blur. The days following the first dream were filled with an eerie sense of unease. Sebastian couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed him out of that nightmare. The shadows in his house felt thicker, darker, and the once comforting solitude of his music studio now sent chills down his spine. Every time he glanced at the cursed violin, sitting innocently on its stand, he felt a cold knot forming in the pit of his stomach. The air around it seemed to ripple subtly, as though the instrument was alive, waiting for him to pick it up again. The music began to haunt him during his waking hours. He'd hear it in the quiet moments, faint at first, just a whisper of a note carried on the wind, or the echo of strings from a distant room. But soon the melody grew louder, more persistent. It invaded every corner of his mind. No matter where he was, he could hear it, a low, mournful tune, echoing endlessly, like a ghostly presence whispering in his ear. It made the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. It was as if the violin was calling to him, begging him to finish the cursed melody it had started. Sebastian tried to distract himself, throwing himself into his work, practicing other pieces, anything to drown out the insidious sound. But even in the midst of other music, the cursed violin's tune slipped through the cracks. His fingers, as if possessed, would drift into playing fragments of the haunting melody, and every time he realized what he was doing, his heart would race with fear. The notes seemed to control him, guiding his hands as though they had a life of their own. One evening, while sitting at the piano, trying to compose something new, a chill swept through the room. The temperature dropped so suddenly that his breath hung in the air, visible in thin clouds. The lights flickered, casting long creeping shadows across the walls. And then, from the corner of his eye, he saw it. Movement. The violin, untouched, sat on its stand, but the bow was swaying gently, as if an invisible hand had brushed against it. Sebastian froze, his blood running cold. His heart pounded in his chest as he stared at the instrument, trying to convince himself it was just a trick of the light. But deep down, he knew. The violin was more than just cursed. It was sentient, and it was growing stronger. He tried to turn away, but the music swelled in his ears, louder now, drowning out his thoughts. The shadows in the room began to shift, elongating unnaturally, twisting into grotesque forms that seemed to dance to the haunting melody. They flickered in the corner of his vision, human-like figures with hollow eyes and gaping mouths stretching toward him. A sudden knock at the door broke the trance, and Sebastian jumped, heart racing. He stumbled toward the door, feeling the weight of dread settling over him like a suffocating blanket. When he opened it, no one was there, only the cold night air seeping into the house, carrying with it the faintest hint of the violin's melody. Shivering, he closed the door and backed away, glancing nervously at the cursed instrument. For the first time, he felt a deep, primal fear clawing at his insides. Whatever had come into his life through that violin wasn't just a curse, it was a presence, something dark and ancient, and it was closing in on him. The sense of impending doom grew with each passing hour. As the once comfortable walls of his home now felt like a prison, the violin had become more than an instrument. It was a gateway, and Sebastian was slowly losing himself to it. And as the days went by, the line between his waking world and the dreams became harder to distinguish. The shadows were no longer confined to his nightmares. They were seeping into his reality, and with them came the growing realization that he was no longer in control. The night when everything changed started like any other. Exhausted from the relentless haunting of the cursed melody, Sebastian collapsed into a restless sleep, hoping for some reprieve from the nightmare that had become his waking life. But the dream came quickly, faster than before, dragging him into its depths with an overwhelming force. This time, the dream didn't begin in a strange room. It started in his own home. His music studio was dimly lit, just as it was in reality, the air thick with the suffocating presence of the violin. The shadows that lingered in the corners of the room seemed more solid, as if they were watching, waiting. As he moved toward the violin, his footsteps echoed unnaturally loud in the silence. the floor creaking under his weight. The instrument seemed to glow faintly in the dim light, its surface shimmering with a malevolent energy. His hands moved without his control, reaching for the bow, and despite the panic rising in his chest, he couldn't stop himself. The moment the bow touched the strings, the room erupted into chaos. The melody that emerged wasn't the haunting, quiet tune he'd heard before. It was violent, frantic, as though the violin itself was screaming through him. The walls of the studio began to twist and warp, bending impossibly as if the house was coming alive. The air was thick with the scent of burning wood and sulfur, filling his lungs with every breath. The floor beneath his feet started to crack, deep fissures spreading like veins through the wood, and from those cracks, a dense black fog began to rise, curling around his legs like cold fingers, pulling him down. The shadows on the walls came to life. No longer just eerie figures, but grotesque beings, their hollow eyes fixed on Sebastian, their mouths twisted in silent screams of torment. Suddenly, the bow slipped from his hand, clattering to the floor with a sharp, piercing sound. The room was silent for a split second, and then the air exploded with the deafening sound of glass shattering. He spun around to see the windows in his studio burst inward, shards flying through the air, carried by a violent gust of wind that seemed to howl with the same pitch as the violin's last note. The temperature plummeted, and in the swirling chaos, Sebastian saw something. No, someone, standing in the doorway. It was a figure, shadowy and indistinct, but unmistakably human. The figure's face was obscured by darkness, but it stood still, watching him with an unnatural calm. Sebastian's heart pounded in his chest as a cold realization gripped him. The figure was not of this world. He could feel it in the air, a presence that exuded pure malevolence. And then it moved, slowly at first, almost gliding across the floor, its eyes glowing faintly like embers. Sebastian stumbled back, his hands trembling as the room continued to collapse around him. The walls seemed to be closing in, the ceiling warping, the very structure of the house distorting with the presence of this dark entity. In a final moment of desperation, he closed his eyes and screamed, hoping to break free from the nightmare. And just like that, everything stopped. Silence. When he opened his eyes, the room was intact, the violin resting peacefully in its place, the shadows receding to their corners. He was back in reality, or so it seemed. But something wasn't right. His hands were still trembling, his breath shallow, and the air around him was cold, too cold. He glanced down at his hands and his heart froze. His fingers were covered in a thin layer of frost, and the violin, it was humming. A soft, persistent note resonated from the strings, despite him not touching it. The line between the dream and reality had blurred, and now a piece of the nightmare had followed him into the waking world. The darkness was no longer confined to his dreams. It was here, and it was waiting for him to play again. The next morning, Sebastian awoke drenched in cold sweat, the eerie hum of the violin still echoing in his mind. The frost on his hands had disappeared, but the memory of it lingered, sending a shiver down his spine. Desperate for answers, he knew he could no longer ignore the growing horror surrounding the instrument. His mind raced with the realization that the nightmare wasn't just a figment of his imagination. The violin was cursed, and whatever darkness it harbored had crossed over into his reality. But how? And why? Determined to uncover the truth, Sebastian began to research the origins of the violin. After days of scouring old records, obscure books, and local folklore, he found something that made his blood run cold. The violin was centuries old, once owned by a composer named Heinrich Krieger, who had died under mysterious circumstances. According to legend, Krieger had been driven mad while composing his final piece, a symphony said to summon dark forces with its completion. He died before he could finish it, his body found in his studio, twisted and contorted as if he'd been in the throes of some unseen terror. His violin had been passed down through generations, and every musician who owned it had either disappeared or met a gruesome fate. Sebastian's heart raced as he realized the truth. The melody he had been playing wasn't just random notes. It was Krieger's unfinished symphony. The violin had been using him to complete it, feeding on his fear, twisting his perception of reality. Each night, the dream had drawn him deeper into the symphony's sinister power, and now it had taken root in his waking life. He could feel it in the air around him. The weight of something watching, something waiting for him to finish what Krieger had started. His investigation led him to a chilling discovery. In an old, forgotten journal, he found sketches of Krieger's symphony, fragments of the cursed melody that matched the very notes Sebastian had been playing in his dreams. Worse, there were descriptions of rituals, ancient rites involving music that could bridge the gap between the living and the dead. The final pages were filled with frantic, barely legible writing, as if Krieger had descended into madness while documenting his findings. The music calls to me. The shadows move when the melody is played. It's not music, it's a summoning. Sebastian felt a cold sweat form on his brow as the words sank in. He wasn't just playing a cursed instrument. He was unknowingly participating in a dark ritual, and each note he played brought him closer to an unimaginable horror. The violin had become more than an instrument. It was a conduit, a gateway to something far darker than he could have ever imagined. The more he played, the more power it gained, and soon, he feared, it would no longer need him to complete the symphony. But the most disturbing revelation was yet to come. As Sebastian pieced together the fragments of Krieger's life, he discovered a photograph, a faded image of Krieger standing next to his violin. The figure in the photo sent a jolt of terror through Sebastian. It was the same shadowy figure he had seen in his dreams, the same figure that had stood in the doorway of his studio, watching him with those glowing, malevolent eyes. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. The figure wasn't just a hallucination or a product of his nightmares. It was Krieger, or whatever was left of him, bound to the violin by the very music he had created. And now, that same entity was using Sebastian to complete the symphony, to finish the ritual that had claimed Krieger's life. Sebastian's breath caught in his throat as he stared at the violin, now humming faintly in the dim light of his studio. The connection between the dream world and reality had solidified, and the cursed melody had woven itself into his very existence. He was no longer just haunted by the music. He was a part of it, trapped in a cycle of madness and terror that had begun centuries ago. In that moment, Sebastian realized the terrifying truth. There was no escape. The violin had chosen him, just as it had chosen Krieger, and the only way to break free was to finish the symphony, or be consumed by it. The line between dream and reality had shattered, and now, Sebastian was left with a horrifying choice: confront the darkness head-on, or let the cursed music claim his soul. Sebastian's world had begun to unravel. Days and nights blended into one another, each moment tainted by the relentless pull of the cursed melody. Sleep had become a luxury he no longer enjoyed, and even in the rare moments of rest, the violin's sinister notes echoed through his dreams, twisting his mind further into a labyrinth of madness. He couldn't escape the feeling that the shadows were watching, always creeping just beyond his field of vision. The walls of his home, once a sanctuary, now felt like a cage, tightening with every haunting note that lingered in the air. Determined to find a way out of this nightmare, Sebastian sought out an old friend, Victor Hale, a fellow musician and expert in occult history, someone he had turned to in the past for obscure musical knowledge. Victor lived in seclusion, far from the city, surrounded by ancient books and forgotten relics of the past. As Sebastian entered Victor's cluttered study, the air thick with dust and forgotten secrets, the weight of desperation settled on his shoulders. He explained the history of the violin, the dreams, the growing influence it had over him, and the terrifying discovery about Krieger's unfinished symphony. Victor's face grew pale as he listened, his fingers nervously tapping against the armrest of his chair. "I've heard of this," he whispered, his voice barely audible. The symphony. It's part of a ritual, a dark one. Music, when used correctly, can open doors. Doors that were never meant to be opened. Krieger was a fool to believe he could control it. Every musician who's touched that violin has suffered the same fate. The shadows you see, the presence in your dreams, it's not just Krieger's ghost, it's something else, something much older. It feeds off the music. Off you. Sebastian's heart sank. The weight of Victor's words pressed down on him, suffocating the last flickers of hope. Is there any way to stop it? He asked, his voice trembling. But even as the words left his mouth, he knew the answer. The violin wasn't just cursed, it was a gateway, a conduit for a darkness far beyond his comprehension. The more he played, the closer that darkness came, seeping into his reality, distorting his perception of time, space, and sanity. Victor handed him an ancient book, its leather cover cracked with age, filled with cryptic symbols and long-forgotten rituals. "There's a way," he said, his eyes dark with the weight of what he was about to reveal. "But it's not without consequences. To stop the music, you must confront the source. Destroy the violin and sever the connection it has with you. But if the violin breaks before the symphony is completed..." Victor hesitated, the words catching in his throat. "The darkness will remain, but without a vessel. It will need something else, someone else, to latch onto, and it may not be as merciful as it's been so far." Sebastian's pulse quickened. The violin was already alive, feeding on him, growing stronger with every note. He knew what Victor was saying. The violin had chosen him, and if he didn't complete the symphony, the entity bound to it would find another way to escape, possibly taking his very soul as payment. Desperation clawed at him, leaving him with a haunting decision: complete the cursed symphony and unleash whatever horrors lay beyond the final note, or risk shattering the violin and facing the unknown consequences. The suffocating tension weighed heavy in the air as Sebastian stood at the precipice of madness. The more he played, the more he lost control. Every attempt to stop felt like drowning. Each time he resisted, the music would claw its way back into his mind, louder, sharper, like the very strings of the violin were cutting into his sanity. Victor warned him of the final danger. The last piece of the symphony could only be completed during a total eclipse of the moon, a rare celestial event that was fast approaching. The symphony, when played under the eclipse, would align the forces at play, opening the final gateway between worlds. Sebastian had mere days to make his decision. In the hours that followed, Sebastian returned home, his mind racing, his heart pounding with a sense of impending doom. The shadows in his house felt more alive than ever, their silent movements taunting him. The violin sat in its corner, quiet for now, but humming faintly with an energy that pulsed through the room. He knew that time was running out. The more he delayed, the closer the dark entity came to claiming him completely. With every moment, Sebastian could feel his grip on reality slipping. The once familiar sights and sounds of his home had become alien, twisted by the influence of the cursed instrument. He had one final chance: to destroy the violin and sever the cursed bond forever, or to surrender to its power and risk losing everything, including his soul, to the darkness. The night of the eclipse had arrived, and with it, a suffocating sense of dread. The moon hung high in the sky, its light slowly fading as the shadow of the earth crept across its surface. Sebastian sat in his music studio, bathed in the eerie twilight, his heart pounding in his chest. The cursed violin lay before him, silent but menacing, like a predator waiting to strike. He knew that this night would either be his salvation or his undoing. The ancient book Victor had given him rested on the desk, its pages open to the ritual, but the words offered little comfort. The air in the room was thick, almost tangible, as if the atmosphere itself was holding its breath, waiting for him to make his move. Sebastian's hands trembled as he reached for the violin, the weight of the instrument feeling heavier than ever before. The bow in his hand was cold, like it had been carved from ice. His mind screamed at him to stop, to destroy the violin before it was too late. but something inside him, the same dark force that had haunted his dreams, urged him to play. As the first note rang out, a sharp dissonant sound that echoed through the room like a scream, the temperature dropped. His breath turned to mist as he played, the melody unfurling from the violin like a dark spell. The shadows on the walls began to move, twisting and contorting. No longer just shadows, but living entities, their grotesque forms writhing as if they were being summoned by the music. The walls of the studio creaked and groaned as though the house itself was reacting to the cursed symphony. Sebastian's heart raced as he played faster, each note sending a ripple of darkness through the room. The shadows grew bolder, creeping closer to him, their hollow eyes glowing with a malevolent light. His fingers moved of their own accord, the violin no longer in his control. The music had taken over, and with it, the darkness seemed to swell, filling every corner of the room with an oppressive, suffocating presence. Suddenly, the figure appeared again, the same shadowy, indistinct form that had haunted his dreams, standing in the doorway. But this time, it was different. It wasn't just a shadow. It was Krieger, or what was left of him. His face was gaunt, twisted with agony, his eyes glowing with an unnatural light. He moved closer, his form flickering like a dying flame, his hand outstretched toward Sebastian. The closer he came, the louder the violin's melody grew, the notes becoming frantic, discordant, as though the instrument was screaming for release. Sebastian felt the weight of Krieger's presence pressing down on him, a cold, suffocating force that filled his lungs with ice. He could barely breathe, his vision blurring as the shadows closed in. But he couldn't stop playing. The music had taken control, pulling him deeper into the cursed symphony, and with every note, the darkness inside him grew stronger. Krieger's face twisted into a hideous grin as he stood over Sebastian, watching as the cursed melody reached its peak. And then, in a moment of pure terror, Sebastian realized the truth. The violin wasn't just a cursed instrument. It was a prison, a vessel for the dark entity that had consumed Krieger and every musician before him. The symphony was never meant to be completed. It was a trap, designed to ensnare those foolish enough to play it, feeding off their fear and madness until it could claim them entirely. The figure before him wasn't just Krieger, it was the entity itself, using Krieger's form to lure Sebastian into finishing the ritual. Sebastian's heart pounded in his chest as the realization hit him. The final note was approaching, and with it, the end of his sanity. The shadows swirled around him, their grotesque forms reaching out with cold, skeletal hands, their whispers filling the room. "Finish the symphony," they hissed, their voices like nails scraping against his mind. "Join us." In a final act of desperation, Sebastian raised the bow for the last note. His hand shook as he hesitated, knowing that playing it would seal his fate. But before he could make his choice, the room exploded into chaos. The shadows surged forward, their forms coalescing into a massive, writhing mass of darkness that engulfed the entire studio. The walls groaned and cracked as the entity's presence filled the room, its twisted form towering over Sebastian. Krieger's voice echoed through the chaos, distorted and broken. "You're mine now." With a scream of pure terror, Sebastian made his decision. He raised the violin high above his head and brought it crashing down onto the floor. The instrument shattered with a deafening crack, the sound reverberating through the room like a gunshot. The shadow shrieked in agony as the violin splintered into pieces, the dark entity recoiling as if it had been struck by a mortal blow. For a moment, there was silence. The shadows writhed and twisted, their forms dissolving into nothingness as the entity's grip on reality began to fade. The temperature in the room slowly returned to normal, and the oppressive weight of the darkness lifted. But as Sebastian stood there, panting and drenched in sweat, he knew that it wasn't over. The entity had been weakened, but not destroyed. The curse had not been lifted. It had only been delayed. The shattered violin lay at his feet, the once beautiful instrument now reduced to splinters. But as he looked down, he saw something that made his blood run cold. Among the debris, a single string remained intact, vibrating softly, humming with the same cursed melody. The entity was still there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for its next chance to escape. Sebastian knew that it would never truly be over. The curse had taken root in his soul, and it would follow him wherever he went. The final note of the symphony had not been played, but the darkness still lingered, watching, waiting for the moment when it could strike again. The moon outside was now fully eclipsed, the night shrouded in darkness. Sebastian stood alone in the dim light of his studio, surrounded by the remnants of his shattered reality. The music had stopped, but the terror had only just begun. In the days following the destruction of the cursed violin, an eerie silence settled over Sebastian's home. The once suffocating presence of the shadows had receded, leaving behind a fragile sense of calm. Yet deep down, he knew it was merely the eye of the storm. The haunting melody that had driven him to the brink of madness no longer echoed through his mind, but a creeping dread remained. The memory of that final night, the sight of Krieger's twisted form, the towering entity, the vibrating string, stayed with him like a scar that refused to heal. Something had shifted. Something had followed him back from the darkness, and he could feel it lurking just beyond the edge of his consciousness. Late at night, as the world around him fell into an unnatural quiet, he would catch fleeting glimpses of movement in the corners of his vision. Shadows that seemed too dark, too solid, slipping past his peripheral view, only to vanish when he turned to face them. It was as if the entity had left a part of itself behind, hidden in the forgotten cracks of his mind. The hairs on the back of his neck would stand on end, and a cold shiver would crawl down his spine, a constant reminder that he was never truly alone. Every night, when the house was silent, he would lie in bed, listening, waiting for the faint sound of the violin's cursed melody to return. As days turned into weeks, the sense of foreboding only grew. The world around him seemed duller, the colors less vibrant, as if reality itself was slowly unraveling. People he spoke to commented on how tired he looked, how distant he had become. But how could he explain it to them? How could he tell them that he had glimpsed something beyond the veil of reality? Something that had marked him? The worst part was the feeling of inevitability, that no matter how far he ran, no matter how long he tried to fight it, the curse would find him again. One night, after weeks of restless sleep, he awoke to a sound that froze his blood. A single note, soft but unmistakable, hummed through the air. It was the violin, but that couldn't be possible. He had destroyed it. Trembling, he rose from his bed, his breath shallow, as he followed the faint sound down the hallway. The house was dark, the moon casting long shadows across the floor, and as he reached his music studio, he stopped dead in his tracks. There, in the center of the room, was the shattered violin. Except it wasn't shattered anymore. The violin lay whole, resting against its stand as if it had never been broken. But something was different. The wood looked older, darker, and the strings, though silent now, vibrated faintly with a life of their own. Sebastian's heart pounded in his chest, his mind racing with disbelief and terror. He stepped closer, every instinct screaming at him to run, to leave the house and never look back. But he couldn't. The pull of the instrument was stronger than ever, and as he reached for the violin, his fingers hovered just above the strings, trembling with fear. In that moment, the air in the room shifted. The temperature dropped and the familiar weight of the entity pressed down on him once more. It was back. The shadows on the walls flickered and twisted, taking on the same grotesque forms that had haunted his dreams. The violin hummed louder, vibrating with a dark energy that pulsed through the room. And then, in a voice that wasn't his own, a whisper echoed in his mind. "Finish the symphony." Sebastian staggered back, his mind reeling. The curse hadn't been broken, it had only been delayed. The entity had been waiting, biding its time, and now it was ready to continue its dark work. He realized with dawning horror that the violin wasn't just an instrument, it was a vessel, and as long as it existed, the darkness would never stop. the entity would never stop.